Number 1. The Lutece Twins. Everything is due to these two and their actions. First, Rosalind invents quantum levitation and Columbia is magically built. We don't know who built it, how resources were required to do so, or how incredibly infeasible structures are connected, and so forth. She then somehow communicates to an alternate reality version of themselves and discovers Robert, who in turn was looking for another version of themselves. This begs the questions, why couldn't they detect multiple, if not infinite, versions of themselves? Robert and Rosalind then open portals to various alternate realities, but most notably get Comstock as Lamb. They both get themselves killed in a freak accident with their devices caused by Fink. As a result of this, they end up becoming immortal, indestructible, or incorporeal, omnipresent gods who can interact with the physical and metaphysical world at will, where time and space is their plaything. If there was to be a plot reveal, it should have been the motive the Luteces had. Why are they doing anything? What care do gods have about some psychotic totalitarian theocrat? We do find that Robert wants to resolve the problem of the girl. We don't know why or what he's trying to do, or why they're involving Booker, since they're invincible, immortal, time-space, multiverse teleporting gods. And if they're not gods, then they're something else. The closest I could think of was the Elysian, who in the TV show Andromeda are beings that are aware of the multiverse and exist throughout all realities and can transfer to such universes via their similar bodies at will. The Luteces are more like a dark version of them, as they force multiple Bookers to go through this insane gauntlet of death, all for what seems like their odd experiment they're tormenting them with.
We are infinite, and yet we are only one. One in every universe, and every one aware of each other.
So why did Robert choose a Booker to save Elizabeth? And tried doing so apparently 121 times before. Of course, we don't know who else they chose those other 121 times, but would it not make sense to choose someone else that would really screw up with Comstock's plans? And after all, his visions into the future are just possible realities. And the Luteces are quixotic gods of the multiverse, so why not bring in someone different? Someone no one expects? Someone from the future? Who doesn't have the mark of the false prophet and wouldn't stupidly hang around in public gatherings and get an entire city against them? The Luteces remind Booker not to choose number 77. Again, this is the belief it's the 122nd iteration of some other Booker entering some other Columbia. They don't have alternate or more detailed explanations to prevent our Booker from getting caught. But really, Booker only gets caught because a policeman notices the AD brand on his right hand. So why didn't they warn Booker about the brand instead? As time-space gods, they can know all and see all, and if not, why repeat the same failed mistake? Of course, Booker's a moron, because he even saw a sign warning him about the brand. Instead of giving Booker a gun in his box at the beginning, which he loses, possibly every time, they should have just given him a pair of gloves. They do want him to be successful in infiltrating Columbia and saving Elizabeth, right? So why aren't they changing the variables in their experiment to make it work? Why wasn't that shown to the audience? So why isn't this a story of revenge or redemption? Why aren't the Luteces the main characters? Why aren't their motives explained? A tale of revenge or redemption would have been something, but it's not really there. Why are they using Booker at all for any of this? Why not just stop Comstock themselves in all realities? Remember, if it wasn't for them, this story could not happen. We have to know why they're bringing Booker with them. What exactly is their goal? If they're rescuing Elizabeth in the most inefficient way, relying on their hair shirt. I was half expecting them to show up at the weird room in the Comstock's airship and just blow his head off, or saying something like, aha, or finally, we wanted to be here to see it in person, but we couldn't because of blah blah Lutece particles, or whatever. You have to limit the power of the gods.
So eventually what we agreed to do is integrate some of the vulnerability into the character again. Because when you have a character that's so powerful, she can wield all this force.
Maybe I can.
What's her point of even being around?
Trance.
Now let's say the Luteces weren't gods and we had to learn about them and they developed their powers as the story went on, and you had to, switch between them as they struggled through the alternate realities, solving logical puzzles because they're snobby British people. They can go about helping each other, reminiscent of games like Zelda, Link to the Past with its Shadow World, or Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, where you can die and play in the spirit world. One could help and escort Elizabeth, and that gameplay would work with the main theme of alternate realities, switching between them and coming back to the original. But instead we get a shooter. And if you don't think Booker's replaceable, well, he's been used 121 times before in and from alternate realities. The game is telling us Booker across the multiverse has been so far useless. And the Luteces have experience of this, but they keep trying the same failed solution over and over for some reason. We're just not given every or any detail on what's different this time round. As Einstein famously said, insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Since there is no loop that involves Booker being stuck, the Luteces must be taking alternate reality Bookers and bringing them to other alternate realities of Columbia, similar to the one Robert came from for whatever reason after their current experiment with their existing iteration of Booker fails. And we have no idea which Elizabeth belongs to which Booker. They could be all different parents and children in Columbia's for all we know. Although that wouldn't matter because each time they bring in a new Booker, his mind gets screwed up anyway, so really, who cares? At what time exactly do they keep getting a new Booker back to a new Columbia, and which Columbia do they bring this Booker back to? And which Booker? It has to be an alternate Columbia and alternate Bookers, else there'd be 121 Lutece siblings in the rain carrying their next Booker onto one boat, or 121 time paradoxes of 121 pairs of Lutece siblings arguing who gets to go on the boat this time. For some reason, doing this 121 times isn't long enough for them to get bored or figure out what variation of what new control to change in their experiment to cause a Booker to be successful in taking on infiltrating a flying country. This is somewhat similar to Planescape Torment, how we discover the plight of the Nameless One who has been dying and going through this process of losing memory and becoming something new. Only now, some unseen force, like you, the player, has finally put him on the right path and led them to their goal. The unseen force in Bioshock Infinite isn't the player character, but the Luteces, and they can rescue Elizabeth at any time. This is the biggest contrivance in the story, similar to Elizabeth's false damsel in distress situation, where beings with metaphysical powers simply don't use them, nor is explained why Elizabeth or Luteces don't, when nearly everything in the story is a result of them. All we can assume is that they're either bored, stupid, insane, forgetful, or are doing things in the hardest way possible because. British, eccentric, insane, alternate reality controlling gods are stupid and bored and keep repeating the same mistakes trying to save a girl they abducted. The player acts as Booker, one of those mistakes. And that's the premise of Bioshock Infinite. The Luteces follow Booker and Elizabeth to alternate realities to help them, but those methods never actually work. So why bother with the same methods? Why not try other methods or share different information this time around? Why not provide real-time help? They do at certain points in the story, but why not as much as possible? Why aren't they sighing or rambling on about how they should have tried plan number 76 again instead of plan number 121Z? Instead, they offer bizarre anecdotes, focusing on the context of when something happens and not what, because apparently they see the multiverse and in it things will happen, just apparently not at the same time, like a person's death, such as Chen Lin, which is inevitable, and whose possible path in the story involves Elizabeth finally accepting herself going through a tear. As their role as a supporting character, they're supposed to help whatever the problem Booker is in. It's like a game they're stuck playing and trying to have fun with, but there's no reason why. They're certainly not teaching Booker, Elizabeth, or the audience anything about the setting or ethics. Elizabeth apparently has never gone through a tear before, but because they give Schrodinger's cat analogies, oh, okay, she's finally good to go. Let's instead go to a slightly less awful version of Columbia instead of just escaping to Paris. It's like the author wanted them to be a combination of the Cheshire Cat and the Tweedledee and Tweedledum characters, even when the Queen of Hearts decrees that they must behead the cat, which ended up trapping them in the fabric of Wonderland and somehow forcing them to be omnipresent ghosts, forever haunting Alice, but never explaining what she should do or why they're so weird and uninterested in their own predicament. Oddly enough, Booker comments on Lady Comstock being a ghost, but not once to the physical nature of Lutece's teleporting, British eccentric grammar rambling supporting god people. With gods in other stories, such as Q in Star Trek, despite being omnipotent, we know why Q is doing what they're doing to Picard and the judgment of humanity. Q has rules they don't break and are the self-imposed guardians of the universe. The Q are also bored, but the Luteces, we don't really know why they're doing what they're doing and in the manner they're doing it. Revenge or redemption is never really shown or explained. The best we get is how Rosalind sees King Lear and Robert sees a blank page. They're dancing, playing catch, working at a bar. This may as well just been a story about time travel instead of the multiverse, and they get killed and fixed and stuck in time somehow, and they're just being weird and incomprehensible about showing up now and again, and the story would have gone just fine. Of course, the writers didn't think of telling the audience reasons to limit the Lutece's powers, or at least define them, or give them their own rules or directives of their personality for us to understand why they just don't do whatever they want. All we know is that they're crazy and behaving like idiots. They just wanted two British accents to act coy. And now we get into the problem of how the multiverse theme works with the issue of determinism versus free will, constants and variables, two sides of the same coin, King Lear and a blank page. As soon as something like metaphysical determinism, also known as hard determinism, exists, the narrative needs to address it. If true, it is absolute and at complete odds of free will, meaning this free will concept just does not exist. Writing such a narrative isn't that hard and is actually easier than dealing with possible free will options per turn in the story, but it still must be done properly, and if not, then a more complicated explanation of soft determinism must exist, where free will and determinism are not only interrelated but compatible, which is a little more interesting but not the purpose of this video to get into. In the book, The Time Traveler's Wife, everything that involves a time traveler going to and from places is absolute. Free will is an illusion. Nothing can be changed. The story is but a romance with simple science fiction elements. It makes sense. In stories that involve time travel, prophecies, or predictions, or absolute future events, the argument for free will must be either subverted or subjugated. If subverted, free will must be played with or have some power, some agency, but only shown in certain areas and specific ways of controlling deterministic events, or vice versa. If subjugated, it is completely removed, or even easier, part of a theme that free will is in fact an illusion. For example, the first bit of dialogue in the game involves Luteces talking about whether or not Booker can row the boat.
I imagine he has a greater interest in getting there than I do.
I suppose he does, but there's no point in asking.
Why not?
Because he doesn't row.
He doesn't row?
No, he doesn't row.
Ah, I see what you mean.
Nothing is stopping Booker or Rosalind from rowing, or Robert from throwing the oars away. Everyone has working arms and freedom of will. This is to show us a simple constant, something that always happens. But, in order for this deterministic force of the universe, or the metaphysics of Bioshock Infinite, to subvert these three people's will, keeping in mind two of these people are gods, the author must explain or show why things must always happen the way they do, or all talk of all things happening a certain way, like constants and variables, become tautologies. Even a soft determinism metaphysic requires individual actions that can be possible, but the motives themselves are deterministic. For example, the point of this experiment is to find out whether Booker could be successful in saving Elizabeth this time through. Okay, where, when, and what scenarios did the previous Booker fail, or Bookers fail? Which variables caused their demise?
Songbird. He always stops you.
Yes, but I would find a way.
No.
Okay, great. The Luteces then have to mention that as being an outcome, a very large factor that needs to be controlled, like in their experiment. If they don't, and don't show us the previous example or talk about it and what they changed to come to a different working solution, then the entire plot of the Luteces, which looks like they're constantly conducting a failed experiment, is redundantly meaningless. It's never revealed to the audience for some reason. For example, if Robert actually asked Booker to row, and somehow Booker has no choice but he just can't, or even though he wants to, and he's telling himself to do it, like, I don't know, he can't move his hands, or he's in sudden pain, or he faints, whatever, then we must accept the fact that the universe and its metaphysical rules, for whatever reason unexplained to us, just will not let Booker row. Only Robert can row. That would be a real constant variable that is shown to occur because it was challenged with a little tool the writer uses called exposition. Much like Songbird, the conflict of rowing cannot be resolved. It creates lore unique to the story. Then, the narrative would explain that saving Elizabeth requires variable X, Y, and Z, or whatever else. This is all ascertained by lore. This could have been shown to the audience with symbolism, foreshadowing, audio logs, nosebleeds, similar patterns, or imagery, a nursery rhyme that repeats, a code, anything the Luteces say, really, because they talk in grammar riddles, so we could relate to and remember whatever this pertinent information is. Instead, they just repeat the Schrodinger's cat analogy, which means nothing to Booker or the audience, and we just end up teleporting to alternate realities and then lose the plot entirely. Once we have clearly established lore, we can begin and believe in things like metaphysics having value, and can at least begin to understand things in a story to have significance, like this being an experiment, and we need to find the right variables to come to a certain outcome. And an easy way would be to say the metaphysics themselves just could be totally random, and that Luteces could not control them, which would limit their abilities. For example, the Bookers of the multiverse are in a maze-like simulation, like the story of the myth of Icaros and Daedalus, fighting the Minotaur in the labyrinth, but there are so many elements in Bioshock Infinite that the choices, the objects, the scenes that mean nothing, like the gore, it's just not justified by their purpose for being. The plot is dropped, they're just there and then forgotten. It's like there was a sale at Chekhov's Armory and the writer just went on some kind of shopping binge but forgot their giant purchase in the parking lot. With the questions it raises and complex and somewhat bloody scenarios we go through as a result of Lutece's guidance, Bioshock Infinite doesn't even begin to explain the concept of the multiverse in any reasonable way. It's just there for drama. Now, this could be the secondary reason why we can relate to Elizabeth, not just because she's a particularly well or clearly written character that gets an arc, but because that's all we can identify with, or at least make sense of in some basic way. On the surface, she's a complex damsel in distress, provided you don't pay attention. The plot was gone less than halfway through the story. Booker's a moron and not even the same Booker we know or what he thinks he knows. Luteces make no sense. The various Comstocks and all other antagonists are psycho. So all we really have to fall back on is Elizabeth, or Elizabeths, and she's really not that believable. Let's think about the lighthouse. And you know that scene where there's a dead man, there's a sign hanging on him that says, "Don't disappoint us"? Is this the work of two scientists trying to come to a conclusion or solution to the save Elizabeth from the songbird problem? Are they trying to bend the rules of causality? Is this trying to instill fear into Booker, a war veteran, one of the variables that needed to be tested, unique to this iteration of Booker? Is this one of the many subtle butterflies that merely need to flap its wings harder? Or was it simply another sensationalist motif, or using gore for shock? And that's all we're really left with. A beautiful world of sound and imagery, of one likable character and a myriad of themes rarely seen in gaming that amounts to meaningless plots, stupid characters, and ultraviolence, all for sensationalism. The main theme is incomprehensible and handled poorly. The premise is insolent and doesn't set out to tell the story it was supposed to in any sophisticated manner that the complex themes deserve. Here's Ken Levine in an interview with Giant Bomb.
Your games tend to have more of a narrative focus than many games out there these days. And how does that work where you kind of have this story in mind or a lot of times completely written and then you're trying to fit the content into that? Like what happens when that content isn't working? Do you have to be flexible with your story and be like, okay, we need to rewrite these beats, like this whole thing isn't working, like we need to do this? Or?
You have to. I mean, they can't be in conflict. That's the thing. It's like the conflict has to get resolved, and quite often writing is the place where you can, it's the cheapest place to resolve
Let's write around
it.
this, and yeah, okay.
Yeah, like we had, there's parts of the game that like we're like, well, this really isn't working, and we're going to change this, and it's like, okay, well, I now have to re-patch together the plot completely to make sure that absorbs it. And in general, that usually leads to it forces you to re-examine your work. And
sure,
there's not a single thing out there that couldn't be rewritten. Like everything. You guys are writers. Everything could be rewritten and make better. Well, hopefully, sometimes you rewrite it. You just try to tell a good story, honestly, and you try to tell a story that's honest, and you try not to compromise in terms of where does the story want to go. And the story often it's a whisper at the beginning, or not even a whisper, but it tells you what it wants to do and where it wants to go. And this is a story that, in the same way that you guys, write pieces, it's a story that I'm always very open to it saying, I really need to go this way, Ken, not that way. And I'm going to listen to people, on the team come up to me and say, really? Is that, where it's going? Because, we are very open to change at Irrational. Well, at least I am very open to change. And, I certainly am a rewriter. Writing is rewriting. And themes, sometimes you don't even know, as you play the game, and I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but the themes sometimes go places you don't even expect, and there are things that seem like an odd ingredient, but you realize are absolutely necessary. It's like, well, I did not know this thing needed nutmeg, but all of a sudden, the rug ties the room together.
Sure, yeah.
When you sacrifice a well-planned out plot, well, you no longer have a well-planned out plot. Plots are basic, and should at least be understood on the surface level and never forgotten by the characters. And yes, rewriting forces the writer to re-examine what they're doing. But not during production. All drama and errors and continuity can be fixed well before game design. Especially God characters. We don't need to know the innermost details of the various plots, but give us at least a consistent one that makes sense. Writing a story on the goal of giving people something to talk about because an ending is speculative without a basic, clearly defined plot and resolution to that plot is, well, it's not good writing. The motives of gods must be translated to the layman, and all we know of the Luteces are they're eccentric, like grammar puzzles. One of them wants to solve the problem with the girl, and apparently they have no clue on how to go about doing that. Bioshock Infinite ends up being one of the most promising games with the highest degree of potential to tell a dramatic, intelligent story in a very unique setting with classic Bioshock gameplay. Instead, it becomes a mess of poorly thought out themes, mediocre gameplay, a not fully realized though dazzling setting, and an unintentionally stupid cast. But it did have Elizabeth and Skylines. And the DLC brings us back to Rapture. Apparently their setting and gods just weren't good enough. It's also considered episode 1, yet is serialized. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, but Elizabeth gets another iteration, and you get to play as her. Here's hoping the antagonists also get an update and not a downgrade. In the DLC preview video, here's Ken Levine talking about the 2 goals of Bioshock Infinite.
To me, the key, there are 2 goals, really. It's like making Elizabeth work was goal number 1. And the fact that we made a game that people talked about, that they debated about, not just like some people, they had debates about some people debated whether they liked it or not, but just what the meaning of things was. That we trusted the audience and they came through. I think that.
So the point of Bioshock Infinite, or its goals, were to technically make the AI behind Elizabeth work and to make people think about what the hell's going on. Sure. Ken, there's plenty of ways to tell a story that's not only profound, but has meaning. Usually this is referred to as layering, using multiple storylines. Bioshock Infinite does not have layers, although it certainly could have considering the multiverse theme. It instead has gibberish. In order to have layers, you need one solid, consistent story, also referred to as the main story.
They said, you know what? You didn't spoon feed this to us, and I love those videos where you watch, people film themselves playing games now, and they put the videos out. We're watching people finish Infinite and just like staring at the screen for 5 minutes, just trying to put it all together. I like that we trusted the audience, and I like that they embraced that trust.
I don't know exactly what Ken is talking about when he refers to embracing the audience. The only trust I can see is the gullibility or lack of intelligence of the audience, if they somehow think the characters are deep and the story is well thought out. That's just insulting. With fantastical elements and poorly explained ideas, we need to be spoon-fed a few times. A good heaping teaspoon of consistent ideas. Not all the time, not constantly, just one big one per idea. Complex philosophical ideas need proper time to be explained. Give us something to work with here, man. Like, give us one constant and one variable that makes sense to the plot. Give us a plot that is consistent, that we can follow, that isn't dropped and followed for no reason, while the setting or universe, for that matter, changes around us. Give us a theme that works with the lore, and the lore is explained and touches metaphysics as necessary, because, boy, do a lot of questions pop up for every character per changing setting. Give us a damsel in distress that's a damsel in distress. Give us a protagonist that is actually needed and necessary, and explain why. Show us, too. Show us that he's not an idiot, and actually what his background says he is, and doesn't get his memories changed every time someone talks to him about his past, or when we go to an alternate reality. Give us intelligent antagonists, which aren't there just to be murdering lunatics whose goals are not completely asinine. Subvert history properly and don't make us laugh at ridiculous use of successful yet antiquated military force in a future setting. Properly use a philosophical issue as a theme like free will versus determinism by choosing a side, argue for it, and then provide detail to make the metaphysics of the world like that, and don't change them. And be very, very careful when you start playing God with supporting characters in any capacity, because they will make your entire narrative be a farcical dreamland. In Bioshock Infinite's case, that was the ending. Once you have a solid, consistent storytelling elements, or series of whatever you created, of whatever new ideas that graced your imagination, then you could put all those secondary themes that aren't too clear, with rounded characters that aren't too round, and their branching, layered storylines that aren't too important. A differing narrative, a frame, whatever. That will allow the audience to interpret those in a variety of ways. That you don't need to be spoon-fed. All lore is the necessary details where an element a writer creates is consistent to what they have established in the universe. When it's not based on the contemporary world, we need that further information. Bioshock Infinite has a few of these things, but they're just not explained or detailed properly.
Because it made it their game, not our game.
Well, you gotta name this.
I'm sorry, Ken, but unfortunately that's not how writing works, or games are just not that sophisticated enough. It's always the author's story, and while game creation is a collaborative process, if you start changing the story just for a level or so Elizabeth can walk properly, there's going to be a big problem. Story, or storytelling, is king in believing the world you're giving us. Aside from drama, there were no multiple paths in the story that meant or caused anything to make it independent to the player. There wasn't any binary character development for us to identify or choose to relate to Booker or Elizabeth as a result of some important choices, unless you think a tiny texture on a pendant makes, a symbolized something, reductio ad absurdum levels, and there were barely any RPG elements unless you think having 4 machine guns and only having enough money to customize one gives one a sense of ownership. And there's really no reason to play a second or any further playthroughs. Nothing changes. It's just a gory shoot-'em-up game that's pretty to look at.
Annabelle?
Excuse me?
Annabelle, it's me, Esther.
Oh, no, I'm not Annabelle.
Are you sure?
My name is Elizabeth. Do I know you?
Elizabeth. Isn't that a lovely name?
That was odd.
Oh yeah, right. Someone calls Elizabeth Annabelle. Yeah, that's really deep. No wonder any continuation of the story of Booker and Elizabeth goes to a better established setting in the series. That alone tells me all I need to know about how valuable and important the world of Bioshock Infinite is.